Well, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you being here. A couple housekeeping things for if you have not yet joined us on a webinar. This is a webinar format, so you don't have to have your camera on or your microphone on. If you do have a question for Kara, I will be asking those to her at the end. So you can use the Q&A feature to put in your questions for the speaker. You're welcome to use the chat function if you just agree with something she's saying or you want to share a personal story with the rest of the audience. But the questions for Kara go in the Q&A box. And you can continue to put where you're from in the chat. We'd love to know where everybody's coming from. And then a recording of this will be available at the end. I will edit it and then put it up on our YouTube page. So welcome to the DAR Museum Online. I am Sarah Kirschbell. I'm the coordinator of museum engagement and outreach for the DAR Museum. Today, we are going to hear from Kara Harris. And this is a part of our monthly Tuesday Talk lecture series. Presented on the second Tuesday of the month, this series highlights topics related to the DAR Museum collection, from decorative arts to American social history to best practices in object preservation. If you're interested in a full list of our upcoming programs and lectures, you can visit our website at www.dar.org/museum. You can also follow us on Facebook or Instagram. We have family programs, Girl Scout programs, symposia, exhibitions, evening events, and more. And so we encourage you, if you're in the area, to go ahead and visit our exhibition called Pleasing Truths, the Power and Portraits in the American Home, which will be up through the end of the year. So you have a little bit of time left before our next exhibition opens in March. And so without further ado, I will introduce Kara Harris. She has been researching and documenting Maryland recipes on her website, Old Line Plate, since 2015. She's been profiled in the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, and on CBS Mornings. Her forthcoming book profiles Maryland celebrations from community recipes from the 1870s to the 1970s. So without further ado, Kara, take it away.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for logging on today. I like to start off by thinking, if you had to choose one recipe to contribute to a community cookbook, what recipe would you choose? Would you choose something you make all the time or something for special occasions? I might choose something that I'd gotten the most compliments on. When you go to write down your recipe, you have to make some choices. I might imply I use only a certain quality of ingredients. Obviously, I want to put forth the best version of this dish after all. Or maybe I'd look at how much sugar or butter is in my recipe and think that, that can't be right. Maybe I'll cut back a little. If you're a cook who improvises, you have to think about the process of writing down your recipe. By writing it down, you're deciding the one way, the best version of your recipe. Who knows, maybe one day your version could be considered the only authentic way to make your dish. I study culinary history, but my specialty is really the recipe, and they're not always the same thing, especially the further you go back in history. Cookbooks and recipes have been around for centuries in different forms, but in the 1800s, there was a cookbook boom. There's a lot of different reasons or possible reasons for this. Social changes like the end of slavery might have left some women without a knowledge of how to cook. The idea of domestic science was on the rise. You might have heard of Fanny Farmer here, who popularized the concept of using standard measurements in recipes. You also had social reformists who were pushing new ideas about nutrition. The idea was spreading that it was a woman's responsibility to feed her family nourishing food. On the other end of the spectrum, you have women like Mrs. Charles Gibson or Mrs. Benjamin Chew Howard here in Maryland. After the Civil War, their way of life was in decline. Compiling books full of recipes was one way to continue the nostalgia for the antebellum era. We're to believe a time of good and plentiful food and Southern hospitality. Also, a lot of church groups published books to benefit charity or even social clubs. Overall, I think that one of the primary drivers was just that it was a cool, fun thing to do. Think of social media showing off pictures of what we eat. That's what these books are like, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of recipes in them. As I started to collect these books and attempt to recreate the dishes in them, I soon learned that they have some limitations. Many of the recipes were copied straight from other books and never tested, or they were just printed to show off the author's social status, how much butter and sugar or hired or enslaved help she could afford. This recipe here was copied from Mary Randolph's cookbook into Mrs. Benjamin Chew Howard, who I showed a few slides ago. And as you can see, she just copied the recipe word for word. A lot of these old recipes also are really vague. When they were written, it was kind of assumed that cooks would have a certain amount of prior knowledge. So recipes for baked goods might just list the amounts for ingredients and then say, cook it in a slow oven. Sometimes they wouldn't even tell you to cook it at all. This is a donut recipe in the middle here that says, wet it with milk into a light dough and set to rise. With meat recipes, I sometimes wonder why they even bothered. A recipe for English meat pie called for any kind of cold meat with a rich gravy or butter. For cooking raw meat, they would just say stew it until done. Standard measurements, consistent ovens, or even having an oven at all didn't become too widespread until the 20th century. Similarly, there was more variation in the ingredients that the cooks would be using. Flour, for instance, I make Maryland recipes, and the kind of wheat used in all-purpose flour that we buy at the grocery store can't even really be grown in Maryland. So millers and bakers would create their own blends depending on the purpose. The flour could vary from mill to mill, household to household, year to year. The texture of someone's bread could have been wildly different. The same is true of yeast. Yeast would come from the air or from a byproduct of beer brewing. There's a lot of different kinds of yeast out there. So the one kind we buy at the grocery store now of flour or yeast is only representing a single possibility for this recipe. We might have no idea what some ingredients used to taste like. Pictured here is liquid yeast that I actually got from a local homebrew group, and they collected this yeast off of a tree. So I attempted to make bread using a traditional wild yeast. You also may have read about lost or rare heirloom vegetables that we don't see anymore. More recently, I've become interested in extinct industrial ingredients. In one cookbook that I have, I found a whole section dedicated to a product called Coraline. It sounds like it was invented during some type of industrial accident happening when processing corn. From reading the patent, it sounds like the dried corn was steamed while being milled, and it came out in little curlicues and could just be cooked with water. I think that the end effect was something similar to instant grits. So when I tried to make a recipe from this cookbook, I used instant grits. But how historic are these muffins if the corn is different, the flour is different, my oven is different, plus the instructions for this recipe just said to bake immediately. Still, I've made hundreds of recipes at this point, and I've indexed thousands of them into my recipe database. So obviously I find some value in it. I think that even what people wanted to project, their wealth, their thrift, or their skill, that can be interesting. By comparing all these cookbooks over time, you can see fads or the gradual adoption of technology. At the turn of the century, there's a lot of chafing dish recipes in cookbooks, or even cookbooks specifically for the chafing dish. There might have been a time when both the chafing dish and the refrigerator seemed like exciting new things that would just be around forever. I rarely even see chafing dishes in the thrift stores, but at the turn of the century, they were all the rage. I also just love these community cookbooks. They all have their own personality. People would add recipes in the margins or write changes to specific recipes. Every church cookbook is a document full of names, people who have backstories, and recipes that reflect trends and changing times. The women who compiled these books were very marketing savvy. They also sold ads to local businesses, and sometimes they incorporated new ingredients, essentially product placement. Baking powder is a good example because it was a huge new ingredient in the 1800s. It revolutionized how people bake. Some people were wary of it being a dangerous chemical, but then lots of home economists put out cookbooks with reassurances that it was safe, plus a bunch of tempting recipes. Before doing this research, I used to think that the past was a little more free of commercial influence. But there's really a fine line between a corporate cookbook and a community cookbook. Often the recipes were exchanged between the two. Here in Maryland, many savvy recipe and cookbook authors also capitalized on Maryland's fame. Maryland food used to be famous across the Western world. Allegedly, one Baltimore caterer shipped his terrapin soup to London. Deviled crabs were popular as far as crabs could safely be shipped, and possibly where they couldn't. Canvasback duck was known far and wide. People would come to Baltimore to eat these dishes. Maryland fried chicken used to be a standard for luxury hotels and railroads. It was served aboard the Titanic. There was actually recently an article about this in which I was lucky enough to be interviewed on the BBC. Not many people know what Maryland fried chicken is anymore. It's generally fried chicken served with cream gravy, but historically no one could ever agree on exactly what it entailed. Some recipes call for it to be served on a waffle. Some recipes call for it to be served with fried mush or fritters, or even steamed in the cooking process. Deviled crab is kind of the forerunner of the crab cake. Sometimes it has similar ingredients. Aside from oysters, this was really the pinnacle of Chesapeake food that people expected to get in Maryland, and deviled crabs were popular right up through the 1950s. When crab meat was industrially picked, usually around Crisfield on Maryland's eastern shore, it was often shipped with the shells so that it could be served in this way. Crab cakes have been around since the 1700s in some form or other, but they didn't really become so popular until the whole Maryland fine dining mystique was starting to fade in the 1950s. Beaten biscuits came to be associated with Maryland. They were invented in a time before baking powder, so it took 30 to 45 minutes of beating the dough to aerate it. The oldest known recipe appears in Mary Randolph's Virginia Housewife cookbook. Some people associated these with slavery because of the labor involved, and one cookbook author published a recipe for them, but also declared them unfit to eat. Terrapin was generally served as soup, sometimes with a cream sauce. This is Mrs. J. Miller Tawes, First Lady of Maryland, in her kitchen preparing terrapin, and she actually put out a cookbook in the 1960s that includes a lot of her Maryland recipes. The population of terrapins became threatened, but the popularity of eating them was actually already declining. Because of this, or maybe just the weirdness of boiling turtles, imitation terrapin dishes have been around since the 1800s as well. Many versions involve a calf's head. I haven't tried that. I did try a version that just uses chicken. There's a theory that Prohibition caused the decline of terrapin soup because the soup was often served with a splash of sherry at the end. I actually don't agree with this. For one thing, many epicures, including Frederick Philip Stieff, who compiled a book in the 1930s full of famous Maryland recipes, he declared that sherry ruined the soup. For another, there was a pretty good amount of liquor available to high society during Prohibition. Baltimore in particular had a lot of people with really huge cellars. Around the holidays, they would serve one of two rivaling drinks, eggnog or apple toddy. We all know what eggnog is, I think. Baltimore versions sometimes contain Madeira wine, allegedly because of it being a port town with all this wine and rum coming in. Apple toddy is a very old and very potent beverage made by infusing rye whiskey with roasted apples and spices, and it's sometimes aged up to a year. And people used to put out bowls of these libations throughout the holidays from pretty much Thanksgiving through New Year's. So they would be made in huge quantities. And when we think of sophisticated cooking today, we often think of chefs working out of restaurants. That mostly wasn't the case in the 19th and early 20th century. Professional chefs were referred to as caterers, and they often worked out of Baltimore's famous hotels like the Emerson, the Southern, and the Belvedere. They also served social clubs and private homes and famous events like the Bachelor's Cotillion. This is the Maryland Club, which had a famous feast featuring terrapin, canvasback duck, and a lot of the other foods that I just mentioned, and it would have been served by caterers. The catering industry was comprised primarily of Black families who kind of built dynasties on this food. And in segregated Baltimore, it enabled some families to accumulate wealth and prestige. But there's kind of a lot of complexity in the way that they were portrayed and appeared in the food culture. In 1917, an author named Julian Street wrote about his travels around the country. He wrote a lot about his stay in Baltimore. He came in through Penn Station. He visited Lexington Market. He stayed at the Belvedere Hotel. He shopped on Antique Row. As he approached the city, he wrote, "My first real view of Baltimore was my first glimpse over the threshold of the South into the land of aristocracy and hospitality, of mules and mammies, plantations, porticos, and proud flirtatious belles, of colonels, cotton, chivalry, and colored cooking." So this was really the image that was sold to tourists who visited Maryland, a story kind of Southern hospitality. I recently put out a book full of holiday recipes from Maryland. I'm kind of fascinated by the ways, especially when I was doing my research, that holiday nostalgia intersects with that whole Maryland mystique. The hotel and catering industries rose to prominence after the Civil War, and they declined during the Civil Rights era. There's a commercial industry built on professional chefs, but most of them didn't leave behind recipes because they didn't really use recipes. But there's an interplay between the hospitality industry and home cooking. Many Marylanders who could never afford or were not allowed to set foot in one of those hotels nevertheless had great pride in their food and the recipes that they shared. Further complicating the picture, we have the influence of groups of people who have come and left Maryland. Some traditions were adopted right into the fold, like sauerkraut served with turkey in Baltimore on Thanksgiving and Christmas, which came by German and Eastern European immigrants, or oyster stew, which stemmed from Irish Catholic traditions of foregoing meat on Christmas. Of course, not all groups have historically had access to produce cookbooks. A lot of people have oral traditions. They don't even bother with recipes to begin with. So my recipe database is always going to be a very biased and uneven sample of what people were cooking and eating in Maryland. I'm lucky enough to have a few cookbooks that are the exception to the rule. Some of them are in local library collections or available online. I used many of these books as sources for my book, Festive Maryland Recipes. This is a book called 300 Years of Black Cooking in St. Mary's County. This amazing cookbook was put out in the 1970s by AmeriCorps volunteers working with a local anti-poverty group called Citizens for Progress. This book has recipes for crab cakes, white potato pie, sweet potato pie, shad roe, poke salad, and it has several recipes for stuffed ham. Stuffed ham originated with the people who were enslaved by Jesuit priests on plantations in St. Mary's County. Some people say it was originally made with other parts of the pigs, and then people started using hams when they were available. The hams are stuffed with a mixture of greens and spices, heavily spiced, including mustard seed and hot pepper. And then they're boiled until everything is well cooked. Stuffed ham is a very special and beloved tradition in St. Mary's County. You can get it in local delis. If you're a part of a St. Mary's County family, you might have that one person in your family who's a keeper of the flame and brings this to your family holidays. Another cookbook I was excited to get to finally reference, because I've been aware of this one for a number of years, is this relatively old Maryland Jewish cookbook. This was put out in 1905 to benefit the Hebrew Day Nursery. It's called Pots, Pans, and Pie Plates and How to Use Them. At the time this book was made, Jewish charities were working with newly immigrated Jewish people from Eastern Europe and helping them to maintain their faith and traditions while also getting them acclimated to life in Baltimore. What's interesting about this book is that it has recipes for crab and oyster and other non-kosher preparations like Maryland fried chicken. This is a book called Recipes from Little Bohemia. This book was put out by the St. Wenceslas Bohemian Catholic Church, which is near Johns Hopkins Hospital. In 1910, the Czech population in the neighborhood known as Little Bohemia numbered somewhere around 10,000. Although this cookbook came out many decades later, and the population of the area was shifting at the time, it still documents many of the recipes that people would have used to celebrate Christmas, including carp soup and a barley casserole called Cuba, which is in my book, Festive Maryland Recipes. In 1907, the Baltimore Sun wrote about how these sturdy foreign-born folk celebrate Yuletide. And they said, "Among Baltimore's adopted citizens, none is more strict in the observance of the feast than the Bohemian, who follows the customs of the old country to the letter. They said that festivities included Christmas trees, colorful candles, and rituals meant to induce good luck. Children hung stockings in anticipation of the expected visit of the Jezusek, Santa Claus. In the article, it says that actually translates to baby Jesus. Early morning mass at this church was a must. They also referred to carp as the Bohemian turkey and said Bohemians would as soon do without their Cuba and carp as Americans without their turkey, mince pie, and plum pudding. When I first made recipes from this cookbook, it's a 1980 cookbook from the Women's Welsh Club of Baltimore, I wasn't aware that the Welsh presence in Maryland dated back to the 1830s when miners came to Western Maryland and Harford County because they had familiarity with the mining equipment used here. In 1981, the owner of my copy of this book tried a few recipes and wrote notes beside them. In the margins, they wrote 1981, good, St. David's Day, or next to a cake, they wrote St. David's Day, 1981, odd but good. The Feast of St. David, who is the patron saint of Wales, is observed on March 1st, the anniversary of his death in 589 AD. This holiday is a celebration of all things Welsh, from food to clothing to flora. The Frostburg Mining Journal newspaper actually announced St. David's Day celebrations at the Mount Zion Welsh Baptist Church annually starting in 1902. I was very excited when I finally found a cookbook from Baltimore's Little Italy. There's so many delicious sounding recipes in here, but I also noticed a lot of recipes for Easter. And I thought a lot about how Easter is such an important holiday in many cultures. I referenced a lot of oral histories, oftentimes including the same people who would contribute to these cookbooks. This particular person did not, but she described Easter in Little Italy. Her name was Ida Cipollini Esposito. And she said that on Easter, it seemed like you just stopped. Everything stopped in the house. By Holy Thursday, your house would be immaculate. Everything had to be clean, and you'd go out visiting the churches. So she said that her family would go through East Baltimore and visit the other Catholic churches, including the local Polish church, probably that Bohemian church as well. This is a very popular cookbook in Baltimore called Ambrosia and Nectar. I've talked to a lot of people who have copies of this book in their kitchen. It's from 1962 and is from the Greek Orthodox Church. My copy was donated to me by the late Dr. Patricia Smith. This book also contains many Easter recipes, which would refer to Greek Orthodox Easter. Sometimes that overlaps with Catholic Easter, but at other times it falls on a different weekend entirely. The recipe we used in Festive Maryland Recipes uses an interesting ingredient, baking ammonia. It smells like ammonia. You add liquid to it, but the smell goes away and then the cookies come out kind of uniquely crispy. Ambrosia and Nectar had other Easter recipes in its book, including lamb lung soup and, of course, bread baked with red Easter eggs. This is a later cookbook of mine. It's from 1986, but I like to reference it because it was put out by the Women's Fellowship of the Bethel Korean Church. It was located in Baltimore at the time. Now it's in Ellicott City. And the Susan Park, the chairperson of this book, wrote that the compilers of the book intended to introduce as many Korean recipes as possible to those who were accustomed to Western food. And the book also repeats the recipes in Korean in the latter half of the book. It includes recipes for kimchi, Korean fried chicken, pickled shrimp, octopus with hot sauce, banana bread, crab imperial, New York cheesecake, corned beef, lasagna, and more. I also reference from a lot of more traditional older Maryland cookbooks, like this classic book is called Maryland's Way. It was put out in the 1960s by Hammond Harwood House. And what they did is they took a lot of those really vague recipes that say cook it until it's done and made the instructions a little bit more descriptive, but the book still feels very historic. It has a lot of beautiful imagery. It was put out to raise money for the Hammond Harwood House in Annapolis. The recipes come from different historic manuscripts at the State Archives, the Maryland Historical Society, and also the author Frances Kelly and her maid Alice Brown took these recipes and adapted them. So they're a little bit more understandable and the ingredients are easy to find. I suspect that that book is the book that really cemented white potato pie as being a Maryland dish. I've seen recipes from other places. White potato pie is like sweet potato pie. It comes from the English tradition of making absolutely everything into a pudding. To a lot of people who are unfamiliar with this, it sounds intriguing and strange, but if you think closely about it, think about rice pudding or something, the standard spices are the same, nutmeg and maybe some cinnamon. I like to flavor mine with lemon. A lot of people associate this pie with the Eastern Shore, but I have recipes from all over the state. A church called All Hallows Church in Davidsonville, Maryland, used to include this in their annual Thanksgiving starting in 1900. I think that did a lot to spread white potato pie in Maryland, and they included the recipe in that Maryland's Way cookbook. Of course, a lot of the cookbooks that I reference are much older, from handwritten community cookbooks all the way back to the first published cookbook published by a Marylander, which is Domestic Cookery by Elizabeth Ellicott Lee. That book is from 1859. The name may ring a bell because she was part of the Quaker family that owned the mills around Ellicott City. Her recipes, including her recipe for New Year's cake, which are what we would now call cookies, little cakes, her recipes made it into other cookbooks like Mrs. Benjamin Chew Howard's 1870 book, 50 Years in a Maryland Kitchen. Her recipe was also copied into some Maryland cookbook manuscripts. The wording and ingredients are often very similar, if not exactly the same. So in this way, by putting these recipes into my database, I can see the influence of certain cookbooks and recipes, or even the social connections through which the recipes spread. Mrs. Benjamin Chew Howard actually copied a ton of her recipes from a slightly lesser known cookbook called Queen of the Kitchen by Mary Lloyd Tyson. I did some research into the author of this book, and she was a relative of Francis Scott Key. And she was also a relative of Mrs. Benjamin Chew Howard by marriage. So they probably even knew each other. One thing I've learned when studying these cookbooks is that basically everyone involved is related in some way or other. Other women in their extended social networks compiled these cookbook manuscripts. It was a very popular thing to do. They would copy recipes from people they knew, or even from women's magazines and newspapers. Newspapers are actually a really big source of recipes, and recipes would be shared in newspapers all over the country. Later newspapers would share recipes from readers. When I cook from these, I often do more research on the people. You can see here, this was a cooking contest in 1911. They published the entire address of the winners. So I use this information and do some research into people, and you can kind of trace their whole life through stories and recipes in these old newspapers. Looking through my database and these newspaper articles, I also found a lot of would-be holiday traditions that didn't survive. They didn't all make it into my book, but I thought a lot about lost holiday recipes that never became traditions at all. Maybe they were simply too of their time. This is an image of a salad that I made called Kris Kringle salad. You slice apples and cook them in a sauce flavored with cinnamon disc candy, and then serve it with sliced avocado. Other similar recipes use pears instead of apples because they're shaped like bells, and you would dye cream cheese to pipe little bows at the top. I don't know about you, but I haven't met anyone who admitted to this being a holiday tradition of theirs. But at the same time, everything was new at one time. Many recipes we take for granted today started as trendy ideas in newspapers, magazines, or cooking shows. My own family has a tradition of eating these donuts called Fastnachts. They're German in origin. They are made on Fat Tuesday. They came to Maryland with German immigrants. In Western Maryland, they're actually known as Kinklings, and there's a Kinkling Day, is Fat Tuesday, essentially. I have some very old recipes for these donuts, and my mother and her siblings talked about these my whole life. But when I looked into my own family's connection to these donuts, it turned out that they came from a 1960s newspaper article by food writer Clementine Paddleford. My grandmother clipped this recipe, and every year after it ran, she would make these donuts for dinner once a year. A few months ago, I set up a booth at the farmers market and I asked people about their Maryland holiday traditions. I heard some great stories. People talked to me about sauerbraten, making apple pies. The variety was great: vegetarian chili, Swedish meatballs. A few people came up and they would tell me about a tradition that was maybe newer. And I sometimes got the sense that they felt like those recipes were less important. But in doing the book, I like to imagine going back to be the first person to use oysters instead of fish in this Christmas stew for the first years in a new land. And that became a tradition that lasted and spread to other groups of people. Or imagine how meaningful it was for the ladies of the Bethel Korean Church to introduce their new friends and family to kimchi and rice cake soup and to celebrate Lunar New Year as their roots in Maryland grew deeper. I once read historian and author Michael Twitty say something that stuck with me. He said, "The food doesn't give us meaning, we give meaning to our food." So we can really honor our ancestors with recipes and traditions that they left us, and we can honor our chosen families with what we bring to the table. Or we can just bring out these recipes year after year because we like the familiar taste and we want an excuse to eat donuts for dinner. If you leave with anything today, I hope that you're inspired to document family or personal recipes, whether you hail from this state or not. The foods you like to eat, the dishes you make for friends, even the foods you would like to try, they're all a part of your history. I'm still very interested in culinary history. I'm still finding new stories every day, finding new manuscripts, new books, and new recipes. When I started a blog based on my database, I committed myself to 2 years of about a recipe a week, but I currently have no end in sight. So this is just a little bit about my current book, Festive Maryland Recipes. It has recipes that have been adapted by recipe developer Rachel Rappaport so that you can follow the recipes at home. This lovely design by my friend Sarah Tomko. And if you're familiar with John Shields, he's actually a chef who has been on public television promoting Maryland recipes for decades. So he was kind enough to write a foreword. I really appreciate it. And can we get to the Q&A?
Sure thing. So first, can you just tell everyone where they can get copies of your book if they are interested?
Oh, yeah, I should have said that, right? I have them at my website, which is oldlineplate.com. You can order them direct and I ship them out. They're also in some Maryland bookstores. I have a list on my website of bookstores, and I encourage people, if you have a local bookstore that you think would be interested in this book, please tell them to contact me because I'd love to get them out there. I just think it's such a beautiful book that I want more people to see it.
And if you need it, I put that oldlineplate.com into the chat box. So you can just click on that link and jump right over there. One question from our audience is, what does Old Line Plate come from?
So Maryland is known as the Old Line State, which is a Revolutionary War reference. So it's just play on words with Old Line State to Old Line Plate. A lot of us in Maryland didn't know about this whole Old Line State thing until the state quarters came out, and we got the quarters that said Old Line State, and everybody had to look it up. So that's where that comes from.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started on this cooking journey?
Yeah, that white potato pie that I showed a few slides ago, actually that exact picture is from a Southern Heritage cookbook that my mother had. And I had never heard of Maryland white potato pie, so I had to make it. There were a lot of other Maryland recipes in this cookbook series, like Maryland baked liver, Maryland fried chicken that I talked about. I was unfamiliar with a lot of these, so I started researching them. I ended up finding that Maryland's Way cookbook, and that was a gateway into a lot more recipes. There's another book I didn't talk about much from the 30s called Eat, Drink, and Be Merry in Maryland. That's even older, and it's just a collection of all these different traditions and things that were really popular at the time, like deviled crab, where it will have many recipes for deviled crabs in it. So I just started going deeper and deeper and working on this database and collecting hundreds of community cookbooks.
What would you say is your favorite recipe to cook?
I actually
Maryland specifically.
Yeah, I like making that white potato pie because it's pretty easy. I just make it in a food processor. I'm trying to think. It kind of changes over time by having so many cookbooks, and my cookbooks range up through modern times. I have access to pretty much any recipe that's made the rounds. So what makes something a Maryland recipe? You know, if it's in a cookbook from Maryland, or I guess you could call it a Maryland recipe. So I've made a lot of things that are more popular around the rest of the country, like the strawberry pretzel salad with Jell-O and like a pretzel crust. That's one that I really like to make, but it's not specifically regional to Maryland like some of these old oddball white potato pie fried chicken. But it made its way to me through Maryland Cookbook. So to me, I associate it with the blog. I also like to make the oyster stew on Christmas. It's just a fun and very easy tradition to resurrect.
We have the Jell-O pretzel tradition in my family as well, but we call it pretzel salad, so it counts as like a side.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, a couple more questions. So why Maryland? Is Maryland unique as a state with a concentration of recipes or ingredients? Would Pennsylvania or Virginia have fewer connection to traditional food? Is it that Baltimore was a prominent city on the mid-Atlantic coast, or why Maryland?
So for me, sticking to Maryland was just a way to limit myself so that I don't try to collect every cookbook. But the more I read, I did kind of find a unique confluence of things, including things from those other states. The Pennsylvania Dutch influences here. It's a part of Baltimore. Scrapple is certainly a Maryland food. And then there's that whole kind of Southern influence as well, which I originally wasn't so aware of. So it's just kind of an interesting history. It's also interesting that it used to just be so well known and kind of isn't now. I don't think people think of much other than crab cakes when they think of Maryland food. But mostly it's just a way to kind of pick something and stick to it. I kind of like to say that, if you ask like, where's the best food in the world? Like, I would like to say Maryland, but also everywhere else, like, let's just let it all be superlative, I think.
Could you say anything more about Mrs. B.C. Howard, the early cookbook author? D.M. Corbett is working on a biography of her husband's aunt, so she's interested in finding a copy of her cookbook.
Oh, interesting. So that cookbook is digitized online, and it should be pretty easy to find. There are also some documents from their family at the Maryland Historical Society. She lived on an estate, a plantation essentially called Belvedere, which is actually near where the Belvedere Hotel is in Baltimore now. I don't know too many specific details of her life other than the cookbook, which was actually put out when she was much older. So, as the title suggests, by the 50 years in a Maryland kitchen. But the book was really popular. There's a 1940s or 1950s reprint of it where they took all the recipes and made them like lower fat and took out the heavy cream and butter. I like to stick to the originals personally, but it was a very popular cookbook and a really good document of that whole Maryland kind of mystique.
And okay, next question is, what info do you note about the recipe in your database aside from the recipe itself?
It depends on the recipe, but I actually have different aspects to my database. I mainly try to get the recipe and then the person, which has been really cool because I've been able to track people. Certain people are prolific in multiple community cookbooks. So I found people who've contributed recipes. One was, I think, the record is from that Women's Welsh Club of Baltimore cookbook. A woman in that cookbook had contributed a recipe to a book in 1930, and that book was 1980. So that's the biggest gap that I have of the same person. And I was able to research her, and it was definitely the same woman. So I get their biographical information. When I actually make the recipes for my blog, I enter all the ingredients and the recipe instructions and everything. But I only do that if something's especially interesting because for now, I'm on the process of trying to just get the names of these different recipes into my database, but it has a lot of aspects. You can tag them with, soups, or I have a tag for white potato pie because a lot of white potato pie recipes used to just be called pudding. So it's a pretty complex database.
And I think the final question I have is, where did you grow up and where do you live now? And did you cook with your mom, grandmother, other?
I grew up in Prince George's County, in Beltsville and Riverdale. And I did cook with my grandmother. We used to pick blackberries and make blackberry pies in the summer, eat them with ice cream, and with shortening crust. So I've diverged from some of those traditions. I like to make a butter crust now. My mother's really good with cooking seafood. My grandfather used to fish and get us all kinds of flounder and game and stuff, which when I was younger, I wasn't involved with the cooking of that. But yeah, I wasn't like a heavy, just at my mom's side cooking all the time, mostly special occasions with my grandmother, like when we'd go gathering.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I think everyone really enjoyed your presentation. There was a lot of stuff in the chat just about how much it was a wonderful presentation, and they enjoyed your research and your references. People also were sharing a lot of memories about what they called pretzel salad, pretzel surprise, eating fried chicken, things like that. So thank you again for taking that time. And we hope to see you again at our next Tuesday Talk, everyone.
I just saw another, another
sure.
question pop up.
Yeah.
They asked if I'd run across colonial recipes. And I actually don't have any that are specifically from Maryland written down that I know of. Most of the history that I know about colonial foods in Maryland, I get from like travel journals, people who visited and came through and talked about what they ate. I think it's interesting because the 1800s, you really have all these written recipes, but the further back you go, there are some manuscripts that are possibly that old. At least sometimes women would start the manuscript and their mother would finish it, or their daughter would finish it. So there are manuscripts that might have both, but I don't know of any recipes that I specifically think of or define as being that old. So just thought I'd get that one. I really appreciate
thanks for catching up.
I appreciate everyone joining us for this, and I appreciate all the questions. And anytime anybody is looking for a recipe or looking for a copy of a cookbook, I'm always happy to try to dig that stuff up and help people find information.
Yeah, so if you visit theoldlimeplate.com, there's information on how to contact Kara, and you can look and see, check out her database and check out her books. Judy just ordered your book, so she's excited.
Thank you so much.
All right, well, everyone, you enjoy the rest of your day, and it was great spending time